Tonight we journey together into one of the most haunting winters ever recorded, the Great Frost of 1709. A winter so cold that entire rivers froze solid, bread turned to stone in kitchens, and the very air seemed to sting like needles on bare skin. Imagine it. Europe blanketed in endless snow. Villages buried in silence and desperate families huddled together in dim cottages, doing everything they could to make it through another period of darkness. This was more than weather. It was a trial, a test of endurance for millions. Before we step fully into this frozen world, I want to welcome you here. If you're listening from the United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, or somewhere far across the sea, I'm so glad you've joined me. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and what point in your existence it is now. Are you winding down for rest, or listening in the middle of the period of darkness when everything feels still and quiet? If you enjoy these calming journeys into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It helps us bring more of these slow, gentle stories to you. Now, take a moment to get comfortable, adjust your pillow, settle under a warm blanket, maybe pour yourself some tea or light a candle. Let the noise of the period of light fall away. When you're ready, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and come with me as we step into the frozen dawn of 1709. The first morning of that January was so still, it felt almost sacred. The sun rose weakly over a pale horizon, its light faint and watery, barely able to cut through the mist. The world was wrapped in white. Not a soft, gentle snow, but a crusted, glittering frost that coated everything in sight. Roofs sparkled like they'd been dusted with crushed glass, and the bare branches of the trees wore shining coats of ice that clinked faintly when the wind stirred. In the villages scattered across Europe, people rose slowly from their beds, the air in their cottages so cold that their breath hung around them like ghostly fog. The floorboards were icy beneath their feet, and the first step outside was a shock. The ground was hard as iron, the frost biting through worn shoes. Farmers went out to check their animals and found them huddled together, their breath rising in little white clouds, their coats rimed with ice. Water buckets had frozen solid, and the sound of trying to break them free rang out sharp and metallic. The smell of smoke from the morning fires hung in the air, mingling with the clean, sharp scent of ice. A smell like fresh linen, but with a bite that stung the nose. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet. No birds sang, no dogs barked. Even the village well seemed to stand frozen in silence, its ropes stiff and brittle. People exchanged uneasy glances as they passed each other on the road. This was more than just a cold morning. This was a cold that felt alive, as though the whole world had taken a deep breath and was holding it. The first period of light of the Great Frost had begun. That first period of darkness came on early, as though the sun was too weak to fight its way across the sky. By late period of light, the light had already turned blue and dim, and the snow that lay over the fields glowed faintly in the gathering dusk. Shadows stretched long and thin, and a hush settled over the countryside. By dawn, the windows were rimed with lace-like frost, so thick it took a knife to scrape them clear. Outside, the world looked even harder, even whiter than it had before. The great frost was deepening, and no one knew what would come next. By the third stretch of existence, the rivers themselves began to surrender to the cold. It started at the edges, a thin sheet of ice, delicate as glass, creeping slowly across the surface. It caught the pale winter sun and reflected it like a mirror, turning every stream and pond into a piece of silver. But the ice did not stay thin for long. Each passing moment added another layer until the water was locked tight beneath a shining white crust. In Paris, the sand grew slower and slower until it seemed to stop entirely, its current muffled by a solid lid of ice. Barges and boats were trapped where they lay, their ropes stiff and frozen to the docks. The usual sound of creaking wood and lapping water vanished, replaced by a strange echoing stillness. Children were the first to test the frozen surface. They crept out cautiously, their boots crunching in the snow, and tapped the ice with sticks before daring to put their weight on it. Soon they were sliding and laughing, their voices ringing across the frozen expanse. For a moment it felt like a holiday, a strange magical playground stretching for miles. But the adults did not smile. Fishermen stood on the banks, staring at the ice where their nets should have been, their livelihoods trapped beneath an unbreakable barrier. They chipped at it with poles, listening to the dull thud of wood against ice. But the layer was too thick. The smell of fish, once so common near the river markets, began to disappear. Elsewhere, traders worried. Goods that were meant to travel by barge sat idle, piled high and rimmed with frost. Grain that should have reached the next village stayed locked in storage, and merchants began counting their stores, already rationing in fear of the future. At night, the rivers groaned and sang, deep, eerie sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Cracks shot across the ice like jagged lightning, sometimes with a sharp, echoing report that startled even the bravest souls. People lying awake in their cottages would hear those sounds in the dark and pull the blankets closer, wondering if the world outside was breaking apart. Still, the sky stayed clear, and the air stayed sharp and bitter. The frost had no intention of leaving. Each morning, when the first light touched the horizon, the rivers gleamed harder, whiter, more solid than the period of existence before. After the rivers froze, the frost found a new ally. The wind. It came howling down from the northeast, sharp and relentless, sweeping across fields, villages, and forests with a force that seemed almost alive. Unlike the still, muffled silence of the first period of existence, this was a cold that moved, a cold that clawed its way through every gap, every seam, every weak point in the walls of homes. The sound of it filled the period of darkness. It rattled shutters, whistled through chimneys, and moaned in the trees with a voice that was never still. Doors shuddered on their hinges, and old thatched roofs trembled as though they might be torn away at any moment. People lay awake, listening, the roar outside pressing against their ears, as if the whole world were breathing down on them. On the roads, carts struggled. Wooden wheels cracked in the frost, their rims splintering under the strain. The grease and axles froze solid, and travelers were forced to abandon wagons at the roadside, their loads quickly hidden beneath drifting snow. Horses stumbled on the ice, their breath steaming in the period of darkness air, their coats heavy with frost. Even the strongest beasts lowered their heads against the cutting wind, eyes half shut, nostrils rimmed with ice crystals. Inside, families huddled closer to the hearth, listening to the storm's voice outside. The flames flickered as drafts slipped under doors and through keyholes. Women pressed cloth into every gap they could find. But still the air seeped in, a presence that could not be banished. The smell of smoke thickened as fires were fed constantly, the wood snapping and spitting in protest. The wind also changed the land itself. Snow which had lain still in soft mounds was lifted and carried across the fields in ghostly waves. Drifts piled high against cottage doors, burying them nearly to the windows. The paths between villages vanished beneath shifting dunes of white. By morning, what had been a road was gone, and travelers who dared the journey often found themselves lost in a landscape that looked the same in every direction. Endless, white, and merciless. Even the trees groaned under the force of the frost-laden gusts. Branches made brittle by the cold snapped and fell with sudden violent cracks that startled animals and echoed through the forest. Hunters spoke of the woods sounding like a battlefield at night, every crack like a distant musket fire. Yet through it all, life went on. In the flickering firelight, fathers mended tools by hand, mothers sewed patches onto warm clothes, and children whispered stories to one another under thick blankets. There was fear, yes, but also a stubborn kind of hope, the quiet determination to endure one more night, and then another. The frost had taken the rivers, and now the wind joined its work. Together they pressed harder against the land, and Europe bent beneath their weight. By the fifth stretch of existence, the cold had moved beyond discomfort. It had begun to change the way people lived. Inside cottages and farmhouses, everything felt slower, quieter, as if the cold had seeped into duration itself. The walls creaked in the period of darkness, their wooden beams tightening under the frost, and the windows were filmed so thick with ice that the outside world appeared only as a pale blur. Food stores once thought sufficient began to show their first cracks, quite literally. Barrels of wine froze solid in cellars, their staves splitting apart with loud pops in the stillness of the period of darkness. The rich red liquid that once promised warmth and cheer spilled across the stone floors and froze mid-flow, shining darkly like glassy ribbons. The air in the cellars smelled sweet and sour, a scent that would not fade. Cheese wheels hardened so much they had to be cut with axes, and milk froze in its pails before it could even be brought indoors. Meat stored in sheds turned to stone, so solid that knives bent against it. Families found themselves crouched over the fire, thawing their food before they could cook it. A slow, careful ritual, the smell of smoke and singed frost mingling in the air. Water became a treasure. Wells froze nearly to the bottom, the ropes stiff with ice, and hauling up a bucket meant scraping frost from the handle before one could even grip it. The water that did come up steamed in the cold air, a ghostly beautiful sight, but froze again within a short duration if left unattended. People adapted as best they could. They brought animals into their homes, the scent of hay and damp fur mixing with wood smoke and cooking fires. Cows stood in the corners, their breath fogging the room, their presence a strange comfort. Goats and chickens clucked and shifted near the hearth, sharing what little warmth there was. Children were given tasks to keep them busy and warm, feeding the fire, polishing the frost from the window glass, gathering kindling from the piles near the door. Their small hands grew red and chapped, but there was little spare duration to complain. Each family member became part of a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Keep the fire alive. Keep the water from freezing. Keep the food from spoiling. Keep moving. Still an unease was growing. Neighbors who once smiled and greeted each other on the road now passed with furrowed brows, speaking in hushed voices about the cold. Some swore they had never seen anything like it. Others murmured that it was a punishment, a sign, a warning. By nightfall, as families settled in again near their fires, the thought began to creep in. This was not just a hard winter. This was something worse, something that might not end soon. By the end of the first span of 7 existences, the cold was no longer simply an inconvenience. It had become a shadow hanging over every conversation, every decision, every quiet moment by the fire. And in the towns where so many relied on the steady rhythm of markets and bakers, the first cracks of fear began to show. In Paris, the streets were lined with silent queues before dawn. People shuffled in place, stamping their numb feet, their breath rising in faint clouds. Bakers worked tirelessly, but the flour they used had frozen into hard blocks that had to be broken apart with hammers. Ovens struggled to keep their heat, their fires dampened by the damp, heavy air. When bread finally appeared on the counters, it was tougher, smaller, harder than anyone remembered. People accepted it quietly, clutching their loaves to their chests as though holding gold. Some broke off small pieces immediately, the steam rising in the frozen air, filling the street with the warm, comforting smell of wheat, but there was never enough to go around. Those at the end of the line often went home empty-handed, their faces drawn and silent. Markets fell into uneasy quiet. Fishmongers had nothing to sell. Their nets were frozen beneath the ice. Butcher stalls stood empty except for a few scraps, quickly taken by the wealthiest customers. Even the smell of the market, once a mixture of bread, smoke, and spices, was fading, replaced by the biting smell of frost and the faint metallic tang of iron from frozen tools and counters. In the evenings, taverns filled not with cheerful voices, but with whispers. People spoke of the grain stored in warehouses, wondering how long it would last. Rumors spread that the frost would go on for multiple spans of 7 existences, that the price of bread would rise again by morning, that carts carrying grain had been lost in the snow. In small towns, markets simply closed. There was no food to trade. People turned instead to one another, sharing what little they had, bartering cloth for grain, firewood for a handful of dried beans. The air inside these places was heavy with the smell of smoke and human breath, the sound of barter, hushed and anxious. At night, as the wind rose and rattled the shutters, there was a new tension in the air. Parents spoke in low voices after the children were asleep, counting their stores, deciding how to stretch them. Some went to bed hungry, choosing to save what they had for the near future, and outside the frost deepened. Each morning the snow glittered harder, the air bit sharper, and the feeling grew stronger. This was only the beginning. Beyond the edges of towns and villages, the forests had transformed. What had once been familiar paths through the woods now seemed alien and treacherous. Trees stripped bare of leaves were sheathed in thick ice. Every branch hung heavy, bending under the frost until it groaned and cracked with the sound of distant musket fire. Occasionally, a branch would fall with a sudden crash, startling both birds and people alike. The air was filled with a sharp, cold scent, a mixture of frozen pine, damp earth, and the faint tang of snow-laden soil. Paths that had once been reliable were lost beneath drifting snow. Deer tracks, fox prints, and the occasional bear mark were all that hinted at life moving through the silent. Travelers dared not wander far. The frost and snow were capable of disorienting even the most experienced hunters. Footsteps crunched in the powder, echoing strangely in the stillness, a lonely sound swallowed quickly by the cold. And yet the wilderness was not empty. Wolves driven closer to human settlements by hunger prowled the edges of the forests. Their howls carried across the frozen fields at night, a haunting chorus that reminded villagers of the dangers just beyond their doors. Families drew closer to fires, listening to the distant cries and whispering prayers, hoping the animals would stay in the shadows. Hunters spoke of the trees themselves seeming to shiver and speak in the wind. Sap froze inside trunks, making them brittle and fragile. Even the moss and lichens that clung to bark seemed coated with frost so thick that it crunched beneath fingers. Streams that had once provided fresh water were now frozen or clogged with snow, and the soft, comforting trickle of running water was replaced by a brittle silence that pressed on the senses. Yet in this frozen wilderness there was also beauty. Icicles hung from cliffs like crystal chandeliers. Snow sparkled in the faint morning light as if sprinkled with powdered silver. The cold air, though biting, was sharp and clear, carrying scents and sounds that had vanished in warmer months. Travelers who dared to move carefully through the woods felt a strange reverence for the quiet power of the frost, a reminder that life persisted, fragile but determined. Inside the villages, the wilderness outside was both a threat and a reminder of resilience. People collected fallen branches for fires, hunted small game if they dared, and shared stories of survival. Even in fear, there was awe at the harsh, beautiful grip of winter. As the frost deepened into its second span of 7 existences, the first whispers of famine began to take shape. What had seemed like a relentless cold now carried a sharper sting. The realization that food, even in the best-stocked homes, might not last. Grain stores that had been carefully tended now bore frost-cracked kernels, brittle and often spoiled. Root vegetables once buried safely in cellars were frozen solid, their skins splitting under the cold, leaving a faint earthy scent in the dim rooms where they were stored. Families moved quietly, measuring every scrap, rationing what little remained. Mothers would slice bread so thin that a single loaf could last through multiple meals. They softened frozen milk over the fire, careful not to boil it, knowing that a single mistake could mean it was lost entirely. Even the simplest meals, a few boiled potatoes, a sliver of cheese, a handful of beans, were made with care, prepared with whispered prayers and measured breaths. In villages, neighbors began sharing what they could, though in hushed tones. Barter became more common than purchase. A handful of flour might be traded for a bundle of kindling. A frozen chicken could be swapped for a few potatoes. The air inside cottages smelled faintly of smoke, frost, and the earthy tang of food being thawed. It was a warm human smell in the bitter cold, carrying a quiet reassurance that life, though threatened, was still being sustained. Even children understood in their own small way the gravity of the frost. They were given tiny portions, taught to savor the taste, and often sent to bed with empty bowls to save supplies for the next period of light. Their laughter was quieter now, tentative, mingling with the crackle of the fire rather than spilling across the room. The periods of darkness were long and still, broken only by the occasional groan of frozen beams or the distant cry of a wolf at the forest edge. In towns, markets began to show the strain. Bakers ran low on flour. Merchants faced the first shortages of beans, lentils, and dried meat. Prices rose quietly at first, then more sharply, though many traders were reluctant to take advantage. Fear and uncertainty made every transaction weighty. Even small gatherings of neighbors seemed tinged with tension, the unspoken understanding that the frost had entered their lives in a way that could not easily be undone. And yet, despite the hunger and the gnawing anxiety, there was resilience. Families huddled closer, shared warmth, and clung to routines, tending fires, checking water supplies, maintaining tools. Every small task became a lifeline, a way to assert control against the vast, unyielding cold. Outside, the snow and ice stretched endlessly, but inside the hearth became a quiet fortress against despair. By the 9th stretch of existence of the great frost, the rivers were no longer just a mirror of the sky, and they had become a symbol of desperation. The ice was thick and unyielding, spanning the width of the Seine, the Lier, and smaller streams that threaded through the countryside. Its surface was smooth and glittering, reflecting the pale winter sun like a sheet of glass. But beneath it, life had been trapped. Fishermen who had once relied on nets and lines to provide sustenance now stood helpless. The nets, frozen and heavy with ice, could not be cast. Holes chipped into the ice yielded only a trickle of water, and even that was a battle to keep from freezing instantly. Their breath rose in clouds, mingling with the faint metallic scent of cold water beneath the ice. They rubbed their hands constantly, trying to keep feeling in their fingers, knowing that even a small frostbite could endanger them for extended duration. Children, oblivious to the adult fears, were drawn to the frozen surfaces, They crept onto the ice in cautious, careful steps, testing its strength with sticks, their small voices ringing through the still air. Some laughed and slid on their stomachs, leaving shallow tracks that glittered in the sunlight. Others simply watched in awe, marveling at the vast, sparkling expanse that stretched for miles. The adults watched silently, torn between wanting to protect them and knowing that the ice was one of the few wonders left in a season otherwise filled with hardship. Traders and townsfolk were forced to adjust. Boats that normally carried food and grain from village to village were immobilized, frozen fast in harbors and riverbanks. Supplies that had once traveled reliably now sat stranded, piles of food and goods covered in snow, slowly cooling, slowly slipping towards spoilage. The smell of damp grain, frozen meat, and stale flour hung over these deserted docks. A quiet reminder that even in the heart of civilization, the frost ruled. The tension grew in the villages. Families calculated how long their stores might last, how much rationing was necessary, and what sacrifices could be made. Conversations at the hearth became quieter, voices tinged with worry. Even laughter was subdued, a careful sound not to disturb the fragile balance of warmth and hope. Yet the frost held a strange beauty. Icicles formed along the river banks, arching like frozen bridges. Snowflakes, delicate and intricate, drifted down to settle in patterns across the ice. The sunlight glinted off the frozen surface in pale diamonds, and for a moment the world seemed magical, suspended between life and the deadly cold that gripped it. Through it all, Europe endured. Even as hunger pressed in, the rivers remained a stage for human courage and quiet resilience, a reminder that life could persist, even beneath a frozen sky. As the frost settled deeper into its second span of 7 existences, the plight of animals became impossible to ignore. Cattle huddled in farmyards, their breath rising in thick clouds that froze to their coarse coats. Their hooves pressed against frozen earth, cracked faintly in the still air. Chickens crouched close to one another in straw-filled coos, feathers ruffled and damp, pecking weakly at frozen grain. Even the smallest animals, rabbits, goats, and barn cats, seemed to shrink under the weight of the cold, seeking warmth wherever they could find it. Farmers moved cautiously among their herds, spreading hay thicker than usual to cushion against the frost-hardened ground. They carried buckets of water, breaking ice with care to offer a drink to thirsty livestock, their fingers numbed almost instantly by the bitter air. The smell of wet straw mingled with smoke from the fires lit to keep animals warm, created a scent that was both comforting and sharp, a reminder of the effort required to survive this frozen world. Birds fared no better. Sparrows and pigeons searched desperately for crumbs, their small bodies shivering, wings coated in frost. Occasionally, a crow would lift from the snow, wings stiff and legs dragging, calling with a rasping call that echoed across the silent fields. Families would toss seeds carefully, creating tiny lifelines for the creatures that shared their suffering, knowing that each small gesture could mean life or death. Even wolves and foxes prowled closer to villages driven by hunger. Their tracks in the snow were silent warnings, and the occasional distant howl reminded villagers that nature was not dormant, but alive and active beneath the frost. Livestock needed protection, and the villagers themselves were learning that survival required vigilance, courage, and constant attention. Inside the homes, families adjusted routines to accommodate both themselves and the animals. Fires were kept burning later into the period of darkness. Barn doors were reinforced with extra straw and cloth to trap warmth. Every small movement, a bucket of water carried, a coat of hay spread, a chicken gathered into the arms of a child, was performed with reverence, as if the cold had made each task sacred. Despite the danger, there were moments of quiet wonder, Coldest glistened on fur and feathers, turning even ordinary barn animals into jeweled silhouettes in the firelight. The hiss of melting ice from the roof merged with the smell of smoke and hay, creating a soft, calming rhythm, almost musical in its repetition. It was in these small, delicate moments that people remembered the fragile beauty of life, even amid relentless hardship. And so the frost continued its hold, testing the endurance of humans and animals alike, shaping every period of light into a slow, careful dance between survival and surrender. By the 11th stretch of existence of the Great Frost, the roads themselves had become treacherous obstacles. Paths that were once familiar now lay buried beneath thick, drifting snow, sculpted into ridges and valleys by the relentless wind. Carriages that once carried merchants, travelers, or messages ground to a halt, their wooden wheels frozen stiff and cracking underweight. Oxmen and horses slipped on the icy ruts, hooves striking sparks of frost from frozen ground, their calls of strain echoing eerily across empty fields. Letters and messages, the lifeblood of communication, were delayed, sometimes indefinitely. Couriers struggled through snowdrifts taller than themselves, their cloaks frozen stiff, faces rimed with ice. Paper curled and cracked in the cold. Ink froze on quills before words could be completed. Families waiting for news held their breaths, listening for the faint crunch of footsteps in the distance or the creak of a cart axle, praying that someone would arrive before the frost claimed another period of light. Villagers and town dwellers alike felt the growing isolation. Without roads or rivers, news moved slowly, and with it came a creeping unease. Those in remote homes relied on the sparse travelers who risked the frost, each visitor bearing tales of hardship or survival from elsewhere. Even familiar faces became precious reminders that life continued beyond the frozen horizon. Animals, too, struggled to adapt to the frozen routes. Horses collapsed from exhaustion on slippery roads. Pack animals balked at snowdrifts taller than their legs. The smell of wet frozen hay lingered as humans and beasts alike struggled to maintain their strength. Villagers offered handfuls of grain, pats of encouragement, or murmured words of comfort, small gestures that felt monumental against the overwhelming cold. Inside cottages, the effects of this isolation became tangible. Families spoke less of distant relatives, more of immediate survival, rationing food, preserving warmth, and tending the frost-bitten animals. The air grew heavy with the scent of smoke, frozen earth, and the faint tang of frost-covered vegetables. Each period of light passed in slow rhythm. Wake, stoke the fire, check water, feed animals, scrape ice, and wait for the light to fade again. The frost pressed onward, reshaping life. Streets lay silent, rivers gleamed glassy and immovable, and the normal patterns of travel and connection were suspended. Yet, despite the isolation, a quiet resilience persisted. Communities huddled close, sharing what they had, exchanging whispers of news, and finding small ways to sustain one another. Every creaking hinge, every scraping footstep, every frozen breath became a testament to endurance against a world temporarily held still. By the 12th stretch of existence of the Great Frost, the quiet unease that had been simmering in villages and towns began to thicken into tension. The frost had stolen the rhythm of existence, and with it came scarcity that weighed heavily on every household. Families measured their supplies with painstaking care, counting each handful of grain, each sliver of bread, and each frozen potato as if it were precious gold. In the morning light, villagers gathered at the remaining open markets, but the stalls that had once overflowed with produce were now thinly stocked. Bakers displayed small loaves hardened at the edges with crusts cracked by frost. Merchants offered handfuls of dried beans, lentils, and scraps of preserved meat, each weighed meticulously. The scent of smoke and charred wood mingled with the earthy aroma of frozen vegetables, and an underlying tension made the air thick. Queues formed silently, each person aware that their neighbors shared the same anxieties. Conversations were hushed, voices low as people speculated on how long the supplies might last. Some whispered about traveling further afield in search of food. Others spoke of bartering or pooling resources with neighbors. The frost had pressed life into a fragile, measured rhythm, where every action carried weight. Children watched and learned. They carried small baskets, helped tally portions, and were taught that every crumb counted. Their laughter was careful, a soft echo that never rose above the murmurs of adults. Even pets and livestock were rationed, their feed distributed with deliberate hands, the smell of damp hay and smoke mingling in the cold kitchens. In the towns, tension sometimes flared. A merchant might raise a price for a loaf of bread, and the air would grow taut with unsaid anger and fear. Families whispered to one another about what they could afford, what they could spare, and what must be saved. Even the simple act of preparing a meal became a test of patience and calculation. Firewood split, water thawed, ingredients rationed, all under the quiet but pressing weight of uncertainty. As the wind rattled the shutters and the frost clung stubbornly to every surface, families huddled around the fire, taking turns stoking the flames, tending the animals, and checking supplies. The warmth was hard-won, the quiet moments fleeting. But in those shared hours, a sense of solidarity grew. Each household became a small fortress of resilience, holding out against the frost and the hunger it brought. And outside, the frost deepened, stretching across the countryside in an unbroken expanse of white. Roads were drifted over. Rivers gleamed like frozen mirrors, and the world beyond the village seemed distant, inaccessible. Yet life endured quietly, deliberately, in each measured step, each rationed meal, and each whispered prayer for warmth, safety, and sustenance. As the frost stretched on, the forests became restless. Hunger gnawed at every living creature, and the bitter cold drove animals closer to human settlements than they had ever dared to venture. Deer, weakened by the frozen undergrowth, stumbled across snowdrifts, their hooves sinking with a muffled crunch. Foxes skirted the edges of villages, their eyes bright and calculating, searching for scraps left unattended. Wolves, the silent hunters of the winter nights, moved in packs along frozen riverbanks and the edges of fields. Their howls cut through the cold, echoing against icy cliffs and across snow-covered plains. It was a haunting, mournful sound, a reminder that even in the stillness, life and death persisted side by side. Children pressed close to their mothers as these calls rose in the night, their small bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from an instinctive fear that something wild and powerful lurked just beyond the walls of their homes. Farmers hurried to reinforce fences and barn doors. They stacked extra straw against walls, heaped feed carefully for their livestock, and patrolled the edges of their property with sticks or poles. The smell of damp hay, frozen manure, and wood smoke filled the air as men and women worked silently, their breath rising in small clouds, mingling with the crisp frost. Even the smallest mistakes, a door left ajar, a loose panel, could allow a wolf or fox into the barn, threatening the fragile lifelines of the household. Birds, too, were pushed from their hiding places. Sparrows, finches, and pigeons searched desperately for crumbs or seeds, hopping across frozen ground with a frantic energy that mirrored human anxiety. Occasionally, a hawk or owl would swoop low, wings slicing through the sharp air, adding tension to the quiet landscape. The wind carried the faint sound of claws on ice, the soft rustle of feathers, and the occasional snap of a branch under heavy snow. Yet in the midst of this danger, there were quiet moments of calm. Frost-laden trees shimmered in the weak morning light. Icicles dangled from roots like delicate chandeliers, and the first sun rays made the snow sparkle in tiny, fleeting rainbows. The forest was alive, both beautiful and threatening, a delicate balance of life, hunger, and survival. Inside cottages, people whispered about what they had seen outside. They reinforced doors again, checked that fires were stoked, and distributed food for both animals and humans with measured care. Every movement, every decision became part of a rhythm dictated by frost, hunger, and instinct. And through it all, the quiet courage of those enduring the frost, human and animal alike, persisted. The winter began to show a fiercer, more relentless face. The sky darkened, and the air grew heavy with the promise of storms. Snow fell first in fine whispering flakes, delicate and almost beautiful, settling on rooftops and fields with soft precision. But soon the whispering turned to force, and then to a full roar. Winds howled across the plains, carrying sheets of snow that cut against faces like shards of ice. Villagers huddled inside their cottages, listening to the storm's fury. Roofs groaned under the weight of accumulating snow, and the icy wind rattled every shutter and pane of glass. Fires became lifelines, a constant glow in the heart of the cold, crackling and hissing as wet wood met flame. The smell of burning pine mingled with the damp metallic tang of frost-laden air. Outside, the world vanished into white. Snow drifts formed taller than fences, swallowing paths, doors, and even small outbuildings. Travelers were trapped, carts abandoned, and horses hobbled in place against the wind's force. Every step was a struggle. Boots sank deep into soft powder, then slipped on hidden ice beneath. Even the bravest hunters and messengers found themselves forced to turn back, their bodies aching from windburn and frostbite. Inside the homes, families worked tirelessly to maintain warmth. Fires were fed constantly, blankets layered over children, and doors sealed with cloth and straw to block the worst gusts. The smell of smoke, bread, and damp wool filled every room. Water froze quickly, forcing repeated careful trips to the well, or melted snow brought in buckets steaming in the firelight. Animals suffered alongside humans. Chickens huddled together, their feathers rimed with frost. Cows shifted in place, pressing against one another for warmth. Even the smallest cat or dog, once playful, now moved sluggishly, seeking every pocket of heat they could find. Farmers murmured encouragement, rubbed frozen limbs, and moved cautiously, knowing that a single misstep could cause serious injury in the slippery, snow-laden yards. Yet in the midst of this chaos, there were moments of quiet wonder. Icicles formed intricate, glimmering patterns along rooftops. Snowflakes caught in the firelight sparkled like tiny stars suspended in the air. And when the storm briefly eased, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath, glittering and still, a fragile peace that reminded everyone that beauty could exist even in the harshest conditions. The storm raged relentless, but it also reinforced a rhythm. Wake, stoke the fire, feed the animals, check water, survive. A slow, measured dance of endurance. And through it all, families, animals, and the frozen world itself endured together. Each breath a testament to persistence against the winter's overwhelming power. The frost's grip had begun to press even harder on the countryside. Roads that were once busy with carts and travelers now lay abandoned under thick layers of snow, their familiar ruts hidden beneath the drifting white. Farmers trudged slowly along these frozen paths, carrying what little they could salvage from fields and storage, boots crunching heavily in the packed snow. Each step was deliberate, careful, as if the cold itself might snatch away a misstep. Carts, once full of grain, vegetables, or firewood, were often left where they stalled. Wheels cracked under the frost, axles froze, and the woods split with a sound sharp enough to echo across the empty fields. Travelers turned back, forced to abandon their supplies, leaving them buried under the ever-shifting snow. The smell of wet timber and frozen straw lingered, mingling with the crisp, sharp scent of the icy air. Families in rural homes felt the pressure mounting. Stored crops were frozen solid. Barns packed with hay and grain threatened to collapse under frost-laden roofs, and wells froze faster than anyone could fetch water. Even the smallest meal became a challenge. Boiling frozen potatoes, thawing milk over the fire, rationing bread with extreme care. Each family had to decide how much to give to children, how much to feed animals, and what to save, knowing that miscalculations could have dire consequences. The cold brought both stillness and quiet panic. People watched the horizon anxiously, scanning for travelers or neighbors who might come for aid. Occasionally someone would arrive, faces frostbitten, eyes tired, carrying tales of frozen rivers, stranded carts, and villages already rationing their stores. Every arrival brought news and anxiety, yet also reassurance. Proof that others were enduring, surviving just as they were. Inside cottages, the fire became a sacred presence, a small island of warmth in a vast frozen world. Families huddled close, listening to the hiss of ice against the windows, the creak of frost-laden beams, and the soft sighs of children drifting into uneasy sleep. Even in these quiet hours, the frost's influence was palpable, shaping every breath, every movement, every thought. And yet life persisted. Despite frozen roads, abandoned carts, and dwindling supplies, the determination to endure carried families forward. Each rationed meal, each careful step along snowbound paths, each shared glance of understanding and support became part of a slow, enduring rhythm, a testament to resilience in a world held captive by frost. The rivers had become both a barrier and a fragile lifeline. Ice covered their surfaces entirely, thick and unbroken in some places, jagged and treacherous in others. What had once been bustling thoroughfares for boats and barges were now mirrors of frost, gleaming silver under the pale winter sun. Yet beneath the ice, the current still moved, carrying the promise of life, fish and water that people desperately needed to survive. Fishermen ventured out cautiously, using long poles to test the strength of the ice before carefully chipping through in narrow holes. Their hands were raw and red from the biting cold, fingers stiff and trembling. The sound of ice breaking was sharp, metallic, echoing across the silent landscape. When a fish was finally caught, its flapping brought a flicker of life and hope, a small reward for the labor and risk of venturing onto the frozen expanse. Villagers worked in shifts to haul water from frozen wells or partially thawed streams. Buckets cracked under the frost, and the liquid that was drawn up steamed immediately in the cold air. Children shivering beneath layers of cloth carried these precious supplies to kitchens, their small hands numb but steady. Parents murmured encouragement, careful not to let worry or fear creep into voices meant to calm the young. At night, the frozen rivers became a stage of quiet tension. Wolves prowled along the banks, their breath rising in small clouds, watching silently from the edges. Footprints in the snow, human and animal alike, formed a delicate, fragile map of life pressed against the frost. Occasionally, the faint creak or crack of ice startled even the most experienced adults, a reminder that the frozen surface could betray them in an instant. Yet, in these harsh conditions, small acts of heroism shone brightly. A father pulled his son back from a thin patch of ice. A young woman carried water through a drifting snowstorm to feed her neighbor's animals, and fishermen worked together, forming human chains to prevent buckets of water from tipping and freezing instantly. Each action, though quiet, held immense weight. The difference between sustenance and deprivation, warmth and misery. The frost, unrelenting, pressed onward, but in every careful step across ice, every thawed bucket of water, every captured fish, the villagers displayed resilience. Life continued in delicate rhythms, testing, chipping, hauling, feeding, and protecting. Even the harshest winter could not completely extinguish the human will to endure. The cold had begun to leave its marks, not only on the land, but on the people themselves. Fingers and toes, even when carefully wrapped, grew stiff and pale. Small chilblains appeared on cheeks and noses, the skin mottled red and purple beneath layers of cloth. Some families noticed coughing and sniffles creeping quietly through their homes, the bitter chill drawing illness like a shadow into every corner. Inside cottages, the air was thick with the mingled scents of smoke, damp wool, and herbs carefully steeped to ward off sickness. Mothers and grandmothers prepared small teas from dried leaves, bitter but warm, and pressed thick blankets around children shivering near the hearth. The crackling fire offered comfort, a soft, flickering light against the long shadows cast by frost-coated walls. Villagers walked more carefully now, aware that each journey outside carried risk. Frostbite could creep up unnoticed in the wind's sharp bite. Hands frozen while hauling water or feeding animals took hours to thaw, the pain quiet but deep, lingering long after the warmth returned. Even adults who were strong and practiced found themselves slowed, their breath catching in white clouds with every effort. Those who became ill moved quietly with gentle care from neighbors. A father might sit beside his feverish child, rubbing hands to warm them, while a mother brought a spoonful of thin broth. The stillness of the room was punctuated by the soft hiss of the fire, the occasional crack of frozen wood, and the muted footsteps of someone fetching water or fuel. Each act of care was deliberate, slow, and patient, a quiet rhythm of survival that became part of the day. Outside, the frost continued unrelenting. Snowdrifts piled higher. The wind carried sheets of icy powder, and the frozen rivers reflected the pale sunlight like endless glass. Even with illness spreading quietly, life pressed on. Animals still needed feeding, fires still needed stoking, and water still had to be carried in small, precious buckets. And yet there was a strange calm. Families learned to move together, anticipating needs and protecting one another. Each careful step, each measured ration of food or water, each wrapped hand or foot was an act of resilience. Despite the frost, despite the creeping illness, the rhythm of human endurance persisted, slow, deliberate, and quietly heroic. The relentless cold had begun to show its cruel effect on crops and stored food. Fields that had once promised harvest were now buried under thick layers of snow and ice. Frost had crept into cellars and barns, freezing potatoes, turnips, and cabbages solid. The outer skins of root vegetables split under the pressure, leaving an earthy aroma of damp soil and frost mingling in the chilly air. Grain stores fared no better. Wheat, oats, and barley, stored carefully in wooden bins, were cracked and shriveled, the frost leaching moisture and vitality from kernels that had promised sustenance. Flour hardened into lumps, requiring laborious breaking with mallets or careful hammering, each small effort releasing a faint, sweet, and slightly bitter scent. Families worked patiently, knowing that every crumb mattered, that every measure of food might be the difference between hunger and survival. In villages, the strain became visible. People whispered quietly about dwindling stores, about neighbors whose barns had failed or whose small fields had yielded nothing beneath the ice. Children were given the smallest portions first, adults often going without in order to preserve life for the young. The smell of cooked food, bread, porridge, or roasted root vegetables was tempered by the faint metallic tang of frost creeping into every corner of kitchens and pantries. Farmers ventured into fields, cautiously, checking for any crop that might have survived beneath the ice. Frost, cracked stems, and frozen leaves told the same story everywhere. The cold would not relent, and the harvest would not come. Animals were fed first from what little remained. Hay distributed sparingly and water carefully thawed, each effort done with deliberate care. Even in the midst of this scarcity, communities adapted. Neighbors shared what they could, trading small portions of grain for firewood or lending tools to dig through snowbound fields. Kitchens were filled with the soft murmur of measured conversation, the rhythmic scraping of frozen vegetables, and the quiet hiss of fires tended with unwavering attention. Each gesture, each small act of cooperation became a thread of hope in a frozen tapestry of struggle. And through it all, the frost pressed on, indifferent to human planning or worry. Snowdrifts rose higher. Rivers gleamed glassy and cold, and the wind carried a sharp bite into every corner of homes and fields. Yet families endured, moving with care and patience, their days governed by slow rhythms of survival and quiet determination against the unyielding winter. The weight of the cold had begun to settle, not only on the land, but in the minds of people. The physical struggle of frozen roads, scarce food, and frost-bitten fingers was compounded by a quiet, creeping anxiety. Every gust of wind, rattling shutters, every crack of ice in a frozen river, and every distant howl of wolves carried a heightened tension. Even the warmth of a hearth could not fully dispel the shadow that had grown over daily life. Inside cottages, families spoke in soft tones, voices measured and deliberate, as if the very sound of raised speech might disturb the fragile order of survival. Children huddled under layers of blankets, listening to whispered conversations about dwindling food, frozen water, and the uncertain days ahead. Mothers and fathers moved with careful purpose, tending the fire, scraping ice, and rationing supplies, each action a quiet defiance against the frost's relentless grasp. Even small acts became sources of courage. A child bringing a frozen bucket of water across the room without spilling it, a father chopping firewood with careful persistence despite stiffened hands, or a mother coaxing frozen milk to thaw over a low fire. Each effort was imbued with significance. These quiet heroics, almost imperceptible, carried the weight of survival and resilience. Villages themselves began to feel the strain. Conversations were tinged with anxiety as neighbors exchanged news of dwindling stores or frost-cracked crops. Some spoke of traveling further to seek food. Others worried that isolation would make rescue impossible. The frost had made the world smaller, every day measured by what could be accomplished before the next night, the next storm, or the next layer of ice claimed another piece of security. Yet there were moments of wonder and calm, even amidst fear. Snowflakes settled softly on windowsills, their intricate patterns catching the pale sunlight. Fires crackled in the hearths, sending flickering light across walls and faces, illuminating determination and quiet bravery. Even in the shadow of uncertainty, families found small ways to nurture hope, sharing stories, tending animals, and holding one another close through the long, frozen nights. The psychological toll of the frost was real, but so too was the strength it drew from humans. Every measured step, every careful ration, every whispered reassurance became a rhythm of endurance. The frost was vast, relentless, and indifferent. Yet within its frozen grip, people quietly found courage, sustaining not only life, but the fragile flame of hope. The warmth of fire had become more precious than ever. Snowdrifts had made travel to the forests perilous, and carts laden with firewood were often abandoned when wheels froze, or animals could no longer pull through the deep powder. Villages began to feel the first real pressure of scarcity. The woodpiles that had seemed ample now looked thin, each log carefully measured and rationed. Families adjusted with ingenuity, Every scrap of timber was used, branches broken from hedges, splintered boards salvaged from barns, and even old furniture reduced to kindling. The air inside cottages was thick with the mingling scents of smoke and charred wood, a sharp, earthy aroma that reminded everyone of both necessity and survival. Fires had to be tended constantly, for even a small lapse could allow temperatures inside to drop dangerously low. Villages moved like shadows outside, carrying bundles of wood, their breaths rising in frost-filled clouds. Every journey was deliberate. Paths were mapped, snowdrifts measured, and neighbors watched for one another, lending hands when needed. Children helped where they could, passing small sticks and logs, learning through repetition the rhythms of endurance. Each movement, slow and careful, was a quiet act of courage against a world held in icy grip. Inside the fire became the heart of daily life. Families clustered close, leaning into the warmth, sharing blankets and layers of clothing, the hiss of logs meeting flames, the crack of splintered wood, and the faint pop of ice melting on the hearth-filled rooms with a gentle, repetitive sound that was strangely comforting, a lullaby of survival. Meals were eaten beside the fire, every bite measured, every sip of warm broth cherished. Even as scarcity pressed in, ingenuity thrived. Villagers insulated their homes with straw, blankets, and layers of cloth. Small stoves were moved to central locations, maximizing heat. Some burned moss, dried leaves, and even frozen reeds, careful to control smoke and preserve precious oxygen. Every decision was slow, deliberate, and guided by experience, instinct, and a profound awareness that warmth meant life. Outside, the frost continued its silent rule. Snow clung to rooftops in heavy drifts. The wind whispered along frozen fields, and the world beyond the village appeared endless, white, and unyielding. Yet within the walls of homes, life persisted. The glow of the fire, the smell of burning wood, and the shared quiet of families huddled together created a small vital refuge against the vast cold. The sense of isolation in towns and villages had grown sharper. Roads that had once carried carts brimming with grain, firewood, and supplies were now impossible. Buried beneath drifts taller than wagon wheels or glazed with ice so slick that even the strongest horses struggled to keep footing. Travelers, couriers, and traders, who had relied on familiar paths, now moved with extreme caution, often turning back before reaching their destinations. Markets felt the strain immediately. Goods that once traveled from village to village, connecting communities with food, tools, and comforts, were frozen in place. Merchants could not reach towns. Shipments were abandoned on the roadside, carts half buried in snow and ice. The faint metallic smell of frozen wagons mingled with the earthy scent of snow-dampened fields, a subtle reminder of how the frost had begun to choke the veins of daily life. Villagers felt the change acutely. Supplies grew scarcer by the day. Flour became precious, beans and grains tightly rationed, and every small purchase was weighed carefully against the need to survive the coming nights. Conversations that once included gossip or stories were now dominated by practical concerns. Who had a spare log for the fire? Who could lend a bucket of water? And whether the frozen river would yield fish today. Even the mail and news systems slowed to a crawl. Letters left undelivered, messages delayed or lost entirely. People waited anxiously, listening for the faint sound of approaching footsteps or carts, hoping for news from distant relatives or neighboring towns. When travelers finally arrived, weary and frostbitten, their reports were both a comfort and a warning. Proof that survival was possible, but only through extreme care and perseverance. Inside homes, the frost's influence continued to shape daily life. Families moved in a careful rhythm, thawing water over the fire, rationing meals, tending animals, and checking for drafts in windows and doors. Every action became deliberate and slow, a necessary adaptation to a world where the outside was frozen and inhospitable. Even small successes, a pot of thawed milk, a recovered firewood bundle, a rescued cart of grain, felt monumental in this frozen landscape. And yet, amid the strain and isolation, a quiet resilience persisted. Neighbors shared resources. Communities adapted routines, and each measured step of survival reinforced the fragile web holding life together. The frost may have halted trade and isolated villages, but it could not extinguish the rhythms of human endurance. The strain on livestock had become impossible to ignore. The bitter cold seeped into barns and pens, chilling the animals even beneath thick layers of straw. Cows shifted uneasily, their breath rising in dense icy clouds, and the clatter of hooves on frozen earth echoed like distant thunder. Chickens crouched close together, feathers ruffled and dusted with frost, their tiny bodies trembling in unison. Every creature seemed to carry the weight of the frost, moving slower, weaker, and more deliberate with each passing day. Families rose to tend their herds, wrapping hands in thick cloth to stave off frostbite. Buckets of thawed water were carefully measured and poured, for too much spilled or frozen could mean the difference between survival and loss. Hay was rationed with precision, spread evenly to ensure that every animal received a portion, no matter how small. The sharp, earthy smell of straw mixed with smoke from indoor fires filled the farmyards, a tangible reminder of the daily effort required to protect life. Even the most resilient animals showed signs of fatigue. Horses, crucial for travel and hauling, stood with stiffened legs, stamping to keep circulation moving through frozen joints. Goats and sheep huddled in corners, pressing close to one another for warmth, the soft sound of bleating punctuating the otherwise silent, frost-laden air. Families whispered encouragement as they moved among the animals, stroking coats, checking for frostbite and ensuring that no one creature fell behind. The frost forced ingenuity. Farmers built windbreaks from snow-packed earth and bundled old blankets over particularly vulnerable animals. Chickens were gathered into tighter coops, and barns were reinforced to trap every possible bit of warmth. Even minimal modifications, propping a door to mitigate the worst of the wind, or placing a stone near a fire to prolong heat radiation, were essential acts of survival. Every decision demanded careful consideration and deliberate execution. Despite the constant attention, apprehension persisted. The loss of a single animal could jeopardize a family's survival, as milk, meat, and labor depended on these creatures. Yet, amidst the tension, a quiet endurance prevailed. Each morning the animals survived, each lasting portion of hay, and every delivery of thawed water to hooves stiff from the cold represented a small triumph against the relentless frost. Even as snow piled up and ice thickened on the barns and fields, families adjusted with patience, care, and an increasing bond with their livestock. The frost exerted unyielding pressure, but life continued with every cautious movement and compassionate action, fragile, intentional, and quietly persistent. The limited availability of food necessitated inventiveness. Villagers carefully ventured away from their homes, searching for whatever the frozen environment could offer. Small game such as rabbits, squirrels, and even birds that had managed to endure the cold became vital resources. Hunters proceeded with quiet intention, pausing to listen to the wind and the subtle sounds beneath the snowdrifts, their breath quickly dissolving in the frigid air. Foraging demanded patience. Families scoured for frozen roots and bark, looking for the slightest sign of life beneath the snow. Frost-cracked root vegetables, small shoots of wild herbs, and the stiff remains of berry bushes were gathered meticulously. The aroma of damp, slightly sweet earth beneath the frost blended with the sharp scent of cold air as villagers stooped low, their fingers numb but steady, collecting food from the frozen ground. Bartering became an understated essential lifeline. One household might trade a small amount of preserved grain for dried herbs, another for a small amount of firewood. Even the tiniest commodities held importance, with each exchange strengthening communal ties and reinforcing the subtle rhythm of survival. Villagers spoke softly, careful not to draw attention to limited provisions, yet they shared information about where food could be found and the best preservation methods. Fishing also required delicate perseverance. Small openings were cut into frozen waterways, and simple lines were lowered into the icy water. Patience was crucial, as any movement might alarm fish already wary from the cold. A catch, whenever it occurred, was celebrated quietly, a small sustaining victory amidst the harsh, frost-covered landscape. Even the youngest children were taught to contribute. They collected frost-covered berries, carried small sticks for the fire, and mastered the careful skill of rationing. Their small, intentional actions mirrored the adults' rhythm, a quiet practice of patience, observation, and respect for the vulnerable world around them. Throughout this period, the frost continued relentlessly, indifferent to human need. Snow accumulated over fields and roads. Ice grew thicker on riverbanks, and the cold wind consistently whispered through the trees. Yet inside cottages, kitchens, and barns, life persisted. Every foraged root, every small fish, every carefully bartered package of supplies stood as a testament to human resourcefulness and quiet courage. And even as scarcity was a constant threat, the rhythm of survival, slow, careful, and intentional, became a comforting constant, a reminder that persistence could find sustenance even during the most severe winter. The surroundings had been transformed into an environment both stunning and perilous. Fields and pastures once holding crops or wildflowers were now hidden beneath deep rolling snowdrifts. Each ridge caught the weak sunlight, shimmering faintly like scattered diamonds. However, the beauty masked underlying hazards. Snow concealed frozen trenches, hidden holes, and icy patches that could trip even the most cautious traveler. Forests were silent realms of frost. Branches bent under layers of snow and ice, creating delicate arches over narrow trails. Icicles hung like fragile ornaments from the eaves of cottages, roof lines, and along tree limbs, dispersing sunlight into fleeting rainbows. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the blended scents of pine, damp soil, and the subtle tang of frozen leaves. Footfalls in this landscape were intentional and careful, each crunch in the snow breaking the silence with a soft, consistent rhythm. Frozen waterways glittered like glass sheets, their surfaces smooth in some areas, jagged in others. The ice reflected the pale winter sky, stretching indefinitely and giving the impression of an ethereal expanse. Beneath the surface, currents still flowed, whispering softly beneath the frozen layer, a reminder of hidden, enduring life. Villagers approached these icy areas with caution, aware that what appeared solid could give way with a single error. Animals left their signs on the frost-covered world. Deer tracks pressed into soft drifts. Foxes moved along frozen paths with precise care. The occasional wolf track hinted at the presence of creatures adapted to the cold in ways humans were not. Even small, resilient birds hopped over crusted snow, their feathers dusted with frost, their calls echoing across the silent spaces like tiny sounds of vitality. Despite the severity, there were moments of wonder and quiet admiration. Sunlight broke through the clouds in the late afternoon, casting long, golden beams across snow-covered fields and glinting off ice-covered branches. Shadows moved gently across the frost, creating patterns that shifted with the wind. Villagers occasionally paused, allowing themselves to absorb the serene, crystal-clear beauty, a brief reminder that the frozen world was not completely hostile. Within this changed environment, life continued with a slow, intentional rhythm. Every careful step across icy fields, every routine tending of animals, every measured portion of food became part of a quiet, soothing pattern. The frost shaped the world, but humanity adapted, observing, respecting, and enduring. In this delicate balance of beauty and danger, families, animals, and the land itself moved together in a fragile, enduring harmony. The cold announced its first true severity. Clouds darkened early, bringing a whisper of snow that quickly became a relentless, heavy fall. Initially, the flakes drifted softly, settling in delicate patterns on rooftops and fields, dusting everything with a quiet beauty. But soon the gentle snow transformed into sheets of powder, driven by icy winds, cutting across faces and stinging exposed skin. Villagers sought refuge inside their homes, feeling the pressure of isolation. Roads and pathways disappeared beneath the persistent accumulation, and familiar landmarks vanished under drifts taller than fences. Horses became anxious. Carts were left where they could no longer proceed, and even the most seasoned travelers retreated, overwhelmed by the storm's power. The smell of cold, wet snow combined with the familiar aromas of smoke and damp wood inside homes, creating a feeling both sharp and comforting. Families adjusted swiftly, moving with deliberate care within the safety of their homes. Fires were continually stoked, logs placed strategically to maximize heat radiation. Blankets were layered over both children and animals, and every doorway was sealed with cloth or straw to block the gusting wind. Even small chores, getting water, tending the hearth, feeding livestock, required extra caution, each step measured against the risk of falling, frostbite, or exhaustion. The storm transformed the auditory environment. The wind howled around corners and over rooftops, rattling shutters and sending snow scraping against walls. Icicles groaned under the weight of new snow, and the soft cracking of frozen timber punctuated the otherwise rhythmic sound of wind and snow. In this stillness broken by the storm, families found a strange, meditative rhythm in survival. Every action was intentional, slow, and imbued with purpose. Even animals felt the storm's intensity. Chickens huddled together, their feathers dusted with fine snow, while cows shifted their weight on frozen floors, pressing close for warmth. Dogs and cats nestled into corners, settling near fires. Their soft, steady breathing merged with the muffled rhythm of the storm outside. Every living thing, human or animal, navigated the storm with cautious resilience, finding safety where possible, and drawing strength from the shared struggle. And yet, amid the chaos, moments of quiet wonder persisted. Snowflakes caught in the firelight created tiny, transient prisms. An occasional ray of sunshine broke through the gray clouds, glinting on snowdrifts like scattered crystals. Villagers paused, even briefly, to notice these details, small reminders that beauty could exist alongside hardship. The storm continued, blocking paths, isolating homes, and demanding patience from all living things. But inside the cottages, life persisted. Fires burned, blankets were wrapped tightly, and slow, careful routines sustained families through the persistent white expanse. In this delicate rhythm, humanity endured, quietly and resiliently, even as the frost intensified its icy grip. The snowstorm forced villages into quiet, frozen isolation. Roads were obscured beneath drifts, carts were immobilized, and even the bravest travelers were confined to home. In response, communities focused inward, finding strength in collective effort and mutual support. Survival settled into a slow, intentional rhythm dependent on cooperation, patience, and careful planning. Families gathered in central homes or barns when the weather permitted, pooling resources to ensure everyone had some provision. Fires burned consistently in larger hearths, providing warmth to multiple households. not just one. The smoke carried the scent of pine, burning straw, and melting snow, filling the air with both the reminder of winter's harshness and the comfort of shared refuge. Children gathered under thick blankets, whispering softly, while adults meticulously rationed food and water, each decision deliberate and thoughtful. Tasks were assigned with quiet precision. Some collected snow for drinking water, while others ensured the animals received adequate feed. Hay was moved from one barn to another, and every log of firewood was counted and divided fairly. Even the smallest contributions, a child carrying a stick to the hearth, a neighbor adjusting a blanket over a frost-bitten goat, held immense importance. Every action was an act of survival, woven into the larger pattern of communal endurance. The frost-laden winds outside howled around clustered cottages, shaking shutters and swirling snow in small whirlwinds across frozen fields. Inside, the warmth of human connection created a contrasting calmness. Conversations were hushed, intentional, often consisting of shared instructions or comforting words. There was no urgency or panic, only the measured rhythm of a community working together. Every breath and step aligned with the steady rhythm of survival. Even meals were shared slowly and with care. Steaming pots of thin broth were carefully served into wooden bowls. Scraps of bread were stretched to feed more people. Each portion was smaller than usual, yet no one went completely hungry. The act of sharing became its own quiet source of comfort, an affirmation that life continued, and that together families could endure even the most severe storm. Outside, the snow continued to accumulate, forming shifting dunes and icy ridges. Wolves and foxes moved along the village edges, wary but drawn closer by the scent of life. Yet the village itself, strengthened by human connection, remained a safe haven. Within walls warmed by fire, sustained by shared effort, and filled with quiet determination, life persisted, intentional, patient, and enduring in the face of relentless frost. Life had settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm dictated by the unrelenting cold. Each morning began before the sun's weak light could reach the snow-covered rooftops. Families awoke beneath heavy blankets, their movements careful and intentional, each breath visible in the frigid air. The initial priority was always warmth, stoking the fire to push back the night's chill, rubbing frozen hands and faces and layering clothes to form protective insulation against the frost clinging to every surface. Children were dressed in soft wool and layered fabrics, their tiny fingers wrapped in mittens and their feet tucked into thick socks. Parents spoke in calm, measured tones, making the morning routine itself soothing, a gentle beginning to a day ruled by necessity. The faint smell of smoke blended with damp wool and melting snow, filling the air, comforting in its familiarity and consistency. Feeding animals became a precise, repeated task. Cows were led to hay carefully portioned to last through the day, while chickens were gathered into coops packed closely for warmth. Horses and goats were checked for signs of frostbite or weakness, their eyes reflecting the low light of winter mornings. Every action was deliberate, each step on frozen ground measured to avoid slipping or injury. Even the smallest task, like breaking frozen hay or scraping ice from a water trough, held immense importance. Meals were slow, methodical affairs. Families gathered near the hearth, eating thin porridge, bread, or preserved vegetables. The fire's warmth softened the frozen edges of food, and the taste of each bite was savored more intensely than in warmer times. Water had to be carefully thawed from buckets of snow or partially frozen streams, a task requiring patience and attention. Every sip was precious against the dryness of the cold air. Throughout the day, villagers maintained a quiet vigilance. Windows were checked for drafts, doors reinforced against gusting winds, and any signs of weakness in animals or structures were immediately addressed. Outside, snowdrifts shifted with the wind, and the distant calls of wildlife served as a reminder of the frost's reach. Inside, the rhythm of work, care, and measured movement became a gentle, reassuring pattern, a soothing reminder that life could continue even under the harshest conditions. Evening brought the slow winding down of the day. Fires burned steadily. Blankets were layered and children were tucked in close, the crackling of wood and soft murmuring of adults creating a lullaby against the relentless cold outside. The frost maintained its quiet dominance, but within the careful routines of daily life, there was warmth, safety, and a slow, deliberate sense of endurance. The forests became both a sanctuary and a challenge for the wildlife inhabiting them. Trees bent under heavy snow, their branches creaking softly, forming archways of white and ice over narrow, hidden trails. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the scent of pine, frozen soil, and the faint, musky signs of animals moving cautiously beneath the snow. Deer navigated slowly through drifts, their ears twitching at the slightest sound, hooves sinking deeply into snow that threatened to conceal hazards. Foxes padded lightly along frozen forest floors, their fur dusted with frost, their eyes keenly aware of both opportunity and danger. Wolves, constantly watchful, prowled in silent groups along the forest edges, their breath rising in steady clouds as they marked paths and scents in the frozen landscape. Birds flitted between ice-laden branches, small and resilient, their calls carrying softly across the white silence. Occasionally, the sharp cry of a hawk broke the air, echoing along frozen ridges and valleys. Even the smallest creatures adapted. Rabbits burrowed beneath deep snowdrifts, their tiny forms leaving subtle, winding tracks that hinted at a hidden life beneath the still, shimmering surface. The frost sculpted every detail of the forest. Icicles clung to every branch, refracting the weak sunlight into transient prisms. Snow drifted into hollowed shapes along fallen logs, creating miniature tunnels and shelters for smaller animals. The gentle sounds of winter, the creaking of timber, the rustle of fur against snow, and the whisper of wind through frost-laden branches formed a quiet, meditative symphony, both soothing and a reminder of the fragile persistence of life. Human observers venturing carefully into the woods moved slowly and deliberately, each step considered. They noted the subtle signs of life, tracks in the snow, the faint movement beneath branches, aware that survival in this frost-bound world depended on patience, observation, and respect for the delicate ecological balance. Even the smallest discovery, a frozen berry bush, a rabbit's shelter, a bird's nest tucked securely beneath ice-coated leaves, became a source of food, hope, or quiet wonder. Inside villages, the rhythm of survival mirrored the forest. Fires burned steadily, meals were carefully rationed, and families moved with calm intentionality. The frost shaped the world outside, but it also shaped the inner lives of those enduring it, instilling patience, resilience, and attention to small miracles. And in the stillness of the forest, under the weight of snow and ice, life persisted, slow, deliberate, and quietly triumphant against the harsh grip of winter. The waterways that once teemed with life had been transformed into vast, glittering expanses of ice. Surfaces that had borne boats, fishermen, and wildlife now stretched smooth and unbroken, reflecting the pale winter sun like endless silver mirrors. In some spots, the ice was thin and dangerous, concealing swirling currents beneath that hinted at their presence through faint cracks and subtle ripples. In others, thick sheets supported the weight of snowdrifts, creating frozen plains that appeared both beautiful and perilous. Fishermen ventured out cautiously, their boots crunching softly against the hardened snow. Long poles tested the ice before small holes were carefully chipped. Each break of ice sounded like a delicate chime in the otherwise silent landscape. The water below was dark and cold, and catching even a single fish required patience, steady hands, and quiet focus. When a fish was finally pulled through the frost-rimmed hole, it brought a small, sustaining victory, a reminder that life continued even in the harshest conditions. Villagers depended heavily on these frozen waterways. Buckets of snow were melted over the fire to provide drinking water, and small hidden springs were sought out, their flow barely audible beneath layers of ice. Every drop became precious. Every successful catch or scoop of water was a quiet triumph. Children bundled in layers of wool and blankets learned to move slowly, carrying pails with careful steps to avoid slipping on slick ice or falling into partially frozen streams. Even animals adjusted to this transformed landscape. Ducks and swans gathered near small patches of open water, their soft calls echoing over ice-covered lakes. Otters, clever and persistent, slipped beneath frozen surfaces, leaving small winding trails in the snow where they emerged to breathe. Wolves and foxes lingered along frozen riverbanks, drawn by faint scents, moving cautiously and silently. The frozen waterways became an arena where both human and animal life interacted with delicacy. Each step was measured, each moment a balance between survival and risk. Inside homes, the icebound rivers shaped daily routines. Water had to be thawed carefully. Fires were stoked constantly, and chores were paced to conserve warmth and energy. Meals were stretched further, intentionally rationed, with each small portion of sustenance reflecting both necessity and patience. Even amid such harshness, there was a quiet rhythm to life. The measured scraping of ice, the soft sound of melting snow, the gentle murmuring of family members coordinating tasks, a symphony of endurance in a frozen world. And throughout it all, the frost continued to sculpt the rivers, lakes, and surrounding land, indifferent to human need, but creating a landscape of subtle beauty and quiet challenge. Every careful step, every thawed bucket of water, every successful catch became part of a slow, deliberate rhythm of survival, a testament to patience, resilience, and the enduring connection between people and the frozen world around them. The nights had become incredibly long, stretching over villages like quiet, unbroken blankets of darkness. Even when the sun appeared, its weak light was brief, slipping behind heavy clouds and quickly fading into gray. Inside cottages, the extended hours of darkness demanded routines that were both practical and comforting, a way to maintain warmth, morale, and a sense of continuity amidst the relentless cold. Families gathered around hearths that burned steadily, the flames crackling and hissing as wet logs slowly released warmth into the rooms. The scent of burning wood mingled with the earthy aroma of thawed vegetables and the faint tang of smoke clinging to wool blankets. Parents guided children through small tasks, checking on animals, gathering firewood, melting snow for water, ensuring that every action was intentional, safe, and purposeful. Evenings became a time for quiet connection. Stories were shared softly, tales of past seasons, ancestors, or imagined adventures. Each voice was measured and soothing. Laughter, gentle and infrequent, offered warmth in ways even fires could not, filling rooms with a sense of community and emotional resilience. Songs were softly hummed, the tones blending with the crackle of firewood, creating a lullaby-like rhythm that threaded through the long night. Meals were slow and deliberate, a time to savor the warmth and sustenance. Broth steamed in bowls. Bread was torn carefully. Small portions of preserved vegetables were shared. Every bite, every sip carried significance. Nourishment not only for the body, but for the quiet assurance that life persisted. That effort and care were rewarded in small, sustaining ways. Outside, the frost painted the village in muted shades of white and gray. Snowdrifts shimmered faintly under moonlight, and the occasional howl of a distant wolf reminded everyone of the world beyond their walls. Windows were obscured with condensation, icicles hung like delicate ornaments from rooftops, and the night held a stillness that was both beautiful and slightly intimidating. Within this quiet, human life maintained a steady rhythm, slow and deliberate, a counterpoint to the harshness outside. By the fire, blankets were adjusted, hands were rubbed warm, and children drifted into sleep with soft murmurs. Adults moved with the same careful cadence, tending embers, rationing supplies, and listening to the hush of the storm outside. The long winter evening, once a source of anxiety, had become a measured rhythm of survival, a slow, comforting dance of warmth, attention, and quiet endurance. The cold had begun to penetrate the core of village life. The cellars, pantries, and storage rooms that had once promised security. Root vegetables lay frozen solid in bins, their skins cracked by ice, releasing a faint earthy smell that permeated the cool air. Barrels of grain, once full and nourishing, had solidified into dense, frost-laden blocks, and flour became lumpy and difficult to handle, requiring patient breaking before use. Families adapted slowly, intentionally, as if each measured action could resist the frost itself. Layers of straw and cloth were draped over storage containers to insulate them from the icy air. Small fires were carefully built near cellar doors or openings, providing just enough warmth to prevent total freezing without risking food spoilage. Even small efforts, propping a door to shield against drafts, rotating vegetables to prevent the cold from settling too deeply, became acts of survival. Each step was calculated with patience and care. Villagers became astute observers of frost patterns. They learned which areas of a cellar remained slightly warmer, which barrels were most exposed to freezing drafts, and how long supplies could last if layered with straw or cloth. Children assisted by moving lighter items, stacking boxes for protection, and carrying small bundles of firewood to nearby kitchens or storage areas. Every movement, every action was slow, deliberate, and imbued with the quiet rhythm of endurance. Cooking became an exercise in creativity. Frozen vegetables were thawed over low heat, grains were soaked before boiling, and dried herbs were carefully rehydrated to improve meals. Even the smallest successes, a tender potato, a lump-free bowl of porridge, a preserved carrot still soft, were quietly celebrated, reminders that life could persist despite the frost's intrusion into every corner of daily life. Outside, snow drifted higher against cellar doors, and icy winds rattled windows and shutters. Yet inside, the warmth of fires, the measured movements of families, and the careful attention to stored food created a sanctuary. The frost was relentless, indifferent, and unyielding. But within the village, human ingenuity, patience, and care maintained the delicate balance of sustenance. Every preserved meal, every carefully rotated barrel, every insulated bin became a small victory, a quiet proof that life could endure even in the harshest winter. The rhythm of careful preservation, slow work, and deliberate attention became a comforting pattern, a steady, patient counterpoint to the relentless cold beyond the walls. The networks connecting villages had begun to break down. Roads that once carried carts of grain, firewood, and other goods were buried under heavy drifts or coated with dangerous ice. Even the most seasoned travelers hesitated to venture out, knowing a mistake could leave them stranded for hours, or worse. The flow of commerce slowed to a crawl, and messages that once traveled quickly were delayed for days, sometimes weeks, as the cold pressed its icy hand over the land. Letters left in village boxes remained untouched and stacked, envelopes curling from dampness and frost, ink smeared in places where melted snow had touched. Couriers huddled in inns and barns, waiting for paths to clear, their breath clouding in the frigid air, fingers stiff from the cold. News of distant towns, of harvests and shortages, arrived in fragments, a few words here, a whispered story there, leaving villagers dependent on careful observation and shared knowledge. Trade, once a necessity, became a subtle, quiet negotiation. Families exchanged small amounts of grain for bundles of firewood, a few preserved vegetables for a handful of dried herbs. Hushed conversations took place inside kitchens and around hearths, decisions made deliberately and slowly. Each transaction was infused with thoughtfulness and care. Even children learned the value of patience, carrying messages, small parcels, or notes from neighbor to neighbor with cautious steps over snow-crusted paths. The frost changed the rhythm of daily life in unexpected ways. Villagers checked on distant neighbors more frequently, sharing news verbally when written messages couldn't reach their destination. Small gatherings formed near larger homes or barns, where firelight offered warmth and community, and the faint murmur of conversation replaced the usual noise of trade. Every shared word, every careful exchange of goods or information became a quiet act of endurance. Despite the increasing isolation, life persisted. People adapted to the slower pace, finding a rhythm in patience and observation. Children listened closely to stories of faraway towns. Adults measured each ration, and the community developed subtle ways to ensure that knowledge, sustenance, and warmth were shared evenly. Outside, snow continued to accumulate. Ice thickened across roads and rivers, and the wind whispered across frozen fields. Yet inside the village, the careful choreography of human connection created a sanctuary of calm, resilience, and quiet perseverance. In this frozen stillness, the frost may have slowed the world, but it couldn't stop it entirely. Every small communication, every traded morsel, every shared piece of news became part of a deliberate rhythm, a slow, patient, and enduring heartbeat against the harsh winter outside. Children had begun to shape their lives around the icy rhythm of winter. Snowdrifts blocked usual paths to schools, and long hours indoors meant lessons took on a new quiet pace. Families adapted, creating small spaces by the fire where books, slates, and writing materials could be used in warmth. The faint smell of smoke mingled with the earthy scent of wool and wood, creating a cozy atmosphere for learning, soft and focused against the sharp chill beyond windows. Learning itself became deliberate and slow. Children traced letters carefully on slates, each stroke measured, and repeated sums or words with hushed voices that blended with the crackling of the fire. Mistakes were met with gentle guidance rather than frustration, and each small accomplishment, a perfectly written word, a solved problem, a remembered fact, was quietly celebrated, offering warmth to hearts chilled by frost and long nights. Play, too, adapted to the frost. Small games took place inside by the hearth or in sheltered corners, with children constructing miniature towns from blocks, snow-dusted sticks, or scraps of wood. Imagination flourished within these frozen walls. A pile of blankets became a mountain, a basket, a boat, and the flickering firelight cast shadows that turned walls into forests, caves, or distant landscapes. Even outside, when the wind subsided, children carefully explored snow-laden fields, leaving winding trails and observing animal tracks, finding fascination in frozen rabbit paths or birds hopping across crusted snow. Stories played a central role in daily life. Parents, grandparents, and older siblings gathered children close, weaving tales that blended history, morality, and imagination. Each story was slow and deliberate, a gentle cadence that soothed, taught, and inspired. The hush of attentive ears, the warmth of proximity, and the rhythm of a narrative unfolding amid the frost created a meditative space where minds could wander, even as bodies were protected from the cold. Even simple routines took on significance. Children helped carry small pails of water, stacked firewood, or tidied spaces around hearths. Each task, performed deliberately, was both practical and part of an unspoken lesson in patience, care, and responsibility. The frost, though harsh, became a teacher of resilience, creativity, and calm endurance, shaping childhood in subtle, gentle ways. In this frozen world where outside paths were blocked and nights stretched long, children adapted with grace and quiet ingenuity, learning, play, and storytelling intertwined with daily survival, creating a rhythm both soothing and sustaining. And in the warmth of firelight, with blankets drawn close and the hush of winter around them, young minds thrived, discovering that even in the coldest of times, imagination and gentle perseverance could bring light and comfort. Clothing had become as crucial as food and fire for survival. Fabric stiffened in the cold, wool shrinking and hardening with frost, while leather boots cracked along seams when wet snow froze against them. Every garment was carefully tended, patched, and layered, creating a delicate balance between warmth, comfort, and mobility. The faint earthy scent of wool mingled with smoke from fires, a reminder that even in harsh conditions, small acts of care could preserve comfort. Families adapted slowly, deliberately. Children's mittens were lined with extra scraps of cloth. Mothers stitched small holes in coats before frost could enlarge them. And fathers carefully greased leather boots to prevent cracking. Every seam repaired, every layer added, became a silent gesture of protection, a tactile reassurance against the chill that pressed from every side. Threads were measured, patches cut precisely, and garments were aired near the fire to restore suppleness without drying them too quickly. Inside homes, the rhythm of textile care became part of the daily routine. Blankets and quilts were spread across chairs and benches during the day, folded and layered at night. Curtains were drawn tightly to block drafts, and extra sheets of cloth were layered over doorways or windows to trap warmth. Even simple actions, shaking out snow from mittens, rubbing gloves between hands, folding small garments carefully, became meditative, a slow, deliberate rhythm that offered both practical benefit and quiet reassurance. Children learned the delicate art of mending and layering. They observed parents darning small holes, sewing patches with careful stitches, and adjusting garments to ensure coverage and warmth. Each task was slow, deliberate, and gentle, teaching patience and attention to detail. Even small successes, a repaired mitten, a softened wool scarf, a layered coat that retained warmth, became quietly celebrated, sustaining morale in subtle but meaningful ways. Outside, the frost continued to press relentlessly. Snow clung to boots and coats, stiffening fabrics and chilling bodies despite careful layering. Yet the careful work inside homes, repairing, insulating, and layering garments, created a sense of security. Each garment, mended with attention and worn with care, became a shield against the cold, a tactile reminder of human ingenuity and patience. By the firelight, families worked slowly, deliberately, maintaining clothing, blankets, and fabrics in ways that supported endurance. The frost pressed hard outside, but inside the warmth of careful hands, attentive mending, and layered textiles formed a protective cocoon. In this steady rhythm, life continued, quiet, deliberate, and resilient. Each stitch, fold, and layer a soft, comforting rhythm against the harsh winter beyond the walls. Even the simplest routines of daily life, tending one's body, keeping clean, and monitoring health, had transformed into careful, deliberate rituals. Water was scarce, often frozen in buckets, streams, or wells, so every drop was precious. Families melted snow slowly over the fire, collecting tiny portions for washing hands, faces, and, when possible, small baths for children. The faint scent of melted snow mingled with the warmth of fire, creating an atmosphere both crisp and comforting. Clothing and bedding were handled with care to preserve warmth and hygiene. Layers were rotated, allowing damp garments to dry near the hearth, while fresh ones were put on. Woolen blankets and quilts were shaken gently to release accumulated snow and frost, preserving both comfort and health. Every movement was deliberate. Shaking, folding, layering, and airing became slow, meditative practices that offered reassurance against the chill. Villagers also monitored their bodies with increasing attentiveness. Frostbitten fingers or toes were gently massaged, the skin inspected for redness or blisters, and warmth was carefully applied to affected areas. A child's cough or shiver was met with quiet attention, wrapping in extra blankets, offering warm liquids, and observing carefully until signs of strength returned. Adults similarly tended to minor aches, strained muscles from shoveling snow or hauling firewood, and fatigue caused by long, cold days, addressing issues with calm, measured care. Even grooming became a ritual of patience. Hair was braided or tucked to protect against frost, and hands were rubbed with warmed cloths after contact with ice or snow. Teeth and mouths were rinsed with small amounts of melted water, while faces were washed carefully, preserving warmth while maintaining cleanliness. These simple acts, repeated daily, became a rhythm, a slow, comforting cadence that reassured bodies and minds alike. The frost outside continued its quiet dominion, winds rattling shutters and snow piling higher on rooftops. Yet inside, the deliberate attention to health and hygiene created warmth, security, and resilience. The tactile act of care, rubbing fingers, tending skin, washing faces, layering clothing, offered both physical protection and emotional comfort. It became part of a gentle, sustaining rhythm, a slow, patient ritual that balanced survival with calm, soothing structure. In this quiet, measured routine, the villagers discovered a subtle truth. Even under the harshest frost, attentive care, patience, and mindfulness could preserve both life and peace of mind. Every small act of attention became a heartbeat of endurance, reinforcing the slow, deliberate rhythm of survival in a world suspended in ice. Winter had begun to assert its full, unyielding power. The first signs of an approaching blizzard appeared as the sky darkened, clouds rolling in with a weight that seemed almost tangible. Snow began to fall softly at first, then quickly thickened, turning the world outside into a shifting wall of white. The wind rose, gusting sharply, carrying the icy sting of frost across rooftops, fields, and forests alike. Villagers retreated to their homes with deliberate care. Horses were secured in barns, animals tended and sheltered, and families closed shutters and doors, tucking thick cloths and straw around any gaps to block the relentless wind. The smell of pine smoke from hearth fires mingled with the crisp tang of cold air that seeped through cracks, a reminder of both the danger outside and the warmth within. Every action was slow, deliberate, and purposeful, each measured movement an act of protection against the storm. Navigation became treacherous. Roads disappeared under deep drifts. Familiar landmarks vanished, and even well-trodden paths were buried beneath shifting snow. Travelers and villagers moving between homes proceeded cautiously, testing each step against the icy surface and listening intently to the low roar of wind across fields. Snowflakes, sharp and swirling, stung faces and hands, and footprints were quickly erased, leaving no guideposts for direction or distance. Inside homes, the rhythm of the storm shaped daily life. Fires burned continuously, their warmth a soft counterpoint to the wildness outside. Families gathered close, sharing blankets and quiet conversation, the sound of the storm blending with the crackle of the hearth. Meals were eaten slowly, water carefully rationed, and attention to animals and basic necessities maintained with calm precision. Each action was deliberate, each breath a measured pause against the harshness beyond the walls. Even the smallest moments of beauty persisted. Icicles hanging from rooftops gleamed in flickering firelight through windows. Snowflakes caught briefly on woolen clothing or hair, and the soft hush of snow settling between gusts created a strange serenity amid the storm's intensity. For children, the storm became both wonder and challenge, their curiosity tempered by the careful guidance of adults, teaching patience, observation, and respect for the forces shaping the frozen world. In this way, the blizzard tested endurance and courage without breaking the quiet rhythm of life. Outside, the frost raged, reshaping the landscape and erasing paths. Inside, deliberate movements, careful attention, and shared warmth created a sanctuary. Each measured step, each layered garment, and each flicker of firelight reinforced the gentle, sustaining cadence of survival, reminding all that even in the wildest storms, life could endure with patience, care, and quiet resilience. Water itself had become a fragile treasure. Wells, once reliable sources of life, were often partially frozen, their surfaces sealed with layers of ice that reflected pale winter light. Streams and ponds flowing freely in warmer months were now solid expanses of silver and white, their currents trapped beneath thick, gleaming sheets. The cold pressed everywhere, leaving the simplest necessity, fresh water, precious and demanding careful management. Families approached water collection with slow, deliberate care. A small hole would be chipped into the ice, covering a well or pond, careful not to break too deep. Buckets were lowered gradually, creaking against icy sides, then raised with equal patience. Each drop of water that reached the surface was handled reverently, poured slowly into vessels, and carried with steady hands back to hearth or kitchen. Even small spills were avoided, for in this frost-bound world, every ounce mattered. Snow itself became a source of hydration, but only when handled thoughtfully. Snow was gathered from safe, clean surfaces, then slowly melted over low flames. The scent of melting snow mingled with the warm, smoky aroma of wood fires, a reminder of both the harshness of winter and the comfort of human ingenuity. Children were taught to assist carefully, carrying small pails, stirring melting snow, and learning the patience required to make ice and snow into drinkable water. Hydration routines became a daily rhythm woven into the broader cadence of survival. Water was measured for cooking, drinking, and washing. Even minor acts, rinsing a basin, filling a cup, dabbing at a child's lips, were performed with calm attention. Each gesture deliberate, slow, and soothing in its rhythm. The cold outside pressed relentlessly, but the careful management of water inside homes created a sense of control, safety, and quiet reassurance. Villagers also observed subtle lessons from the frost itself. Certain parts of the well or stream thawed slightly during midday sun, while others remained sealed under thick ice. Knowledge of these patterns became invaluable, guiding collection times and methods. Every successful retrieval, every carefully rationed cup became a small triumph, a testament to patience, observation, and the slow, steady beat of endurance in a frozen world. In this delicate balance between frost and survival, water was no longer simply a necessity. It became a rhythm, a deliberate practice of care and a comforting reminder that even under relentless cold, thoughtful attention could preserve life. Each pour, each careful sip, each small act of management reinforced the gentle cadence of human resilience against the unyielding frost. Firewood had become the most precious lifeline for every village. The bitter cold pressed against doors and windows, reminding all that warmth was not a luxury, but a necessity for survival. Families approached their hearths with deliberate care, ensuring that each log was used wisely, each spark nurtured into steady flame, and each ember preserved throughout the long nights. Wood was gathered slowly, deliberately, often from nearby forests where snow-laden branches creaked under weight. Villagers carefully avoided overexertion, moving in measured steps through icy paths while carrying bundles of split logs or branches. The scent of pine and oak mingled with crisp, cold air, leaving a lingering reminder of the frozen woods from which warmth was drawn. Storage became a careful art. Stacks of wood were layered to prevent snow and moisture from reaching the inner logs. Straw was used to insulate piles, and covered sheds became small sanctuaries, keeping precious fuel dry. Even the smallest log was treated with reverence. Every split measured, every piece stacked to ensure easy access and minimal waste. Children assisted carrying light pieces or sweeping snow from pathways, learning the rhythm of careful, patient contribution. Inside cottages, fires were tended constantly. Each log was added with deliberate timing, coaxing the flame without smothering it. Sparks danced across hearths, the soft crackle and hiss blending with the hush of snow outside and the gentle murmur of human life within. Families huddled near the warmth, blankets drawn, hot drinks in hand, the firelight casting dancing shadows that stretched across walls and furniture. Evenings became a ritual of preservation. Flames were banked, embers gently stoked, and coals shifted slowly to maintain steady heat. Conversations were hushed, movements gentle, creating a calm, soothing rhythm of care that reinforced both physical warmth and emotional security. The frost may have gripped the world outside with icy fingers, but inside, deliberate attention to firewood and heating created a sanctuary, a heartbeat of resilience and quiet comfort. In this balance between frost and warmth, every log, every ember, every measured tending of fire became a small victory. Life persisted in the rhythm of care, in the deliberate pacing of human effort, and in the quiet understanding that survival was maintained not in haste, but in patient, gentle attention. The lives of villagers and their animals were bound together by the slow, deliberate rhythm of survival. Livestock, once free to graze across fields, now relied entirely on human care, their well-being resting on careful feeding, sheltering, and gentle attention. Snow-laden barns and pens became havens of warmth and motion, filled with the soft sounds of animals shifting, breathing, and seeking comfort. Cows and goats were grouped together to conserve heat, hay layered beneath them to soften frozen floors, and sturdy boards or straw walls shielded against drafts. Each animal's condition was observed with patience, eyes examined for signs of fatigue, hooves checked for ice buildup, and fur brushed or smoothed to preserve warmth. Even minor changes, a shiver, a slow step, a lowered head, were noted with care, prompting adjustments to bedding or feeding. Feeding became a deliberate, rhythmic process. Frozen hay was broken into smaller portions, softened where necessary by warm water, and distributed evenly. Grain was measured with precision, rationed to provide sustenance without waste, while scraps of preserved vegetables were shared in moderation, each bite carefully considered. Children were often enlisted for lighter tasks, carrying small baskets, brushing animals gently, or helping stack hay, learning patience and the delicate balance of care. The frost outside created constant vigilance. Snow drifted against barns covering entrances, and winds rattled doors, threatening to chill animals if gaps were left unchecked. Families moved deliberately, closing shutters, adjusting straw bales, and checking that water supplies remained thawed for animals. Each task was slow, careful, and methodical, a rhythm of attention that mirrored the human struggle against winter's icy grasp. Even small moments of beauty persisted amidst the hardship. The breath of animals rose in soft clouds curling in the firelight or pale sun streaming through frosted windows. The low hum of contented rumbling from cows or the gentle bleating of goats blended with the quiet crackle of the hearth and the hush of snow outside. These sounds, subtle and comforting, became part of a meditative rhythm, reminding villagers that life, though challenged, persisted with resilience and grace. By tending livestock with patience and gentle diligence, villagers not only preserved food and warmth, but also maintained a bond of care and connection. The frost could shape the world outside, but inside barns and pens, careful attention created sanctuaries of life and quiet endurance. Every stroke of a hand, every portion of hay, every measured ration became part of the slow, sustaining rhythm of survival, a soft, reassuring heartbeat amid the relentless cold. Travel beyond the village had become a deliberate, cautious endeavor. Roads and pathways, once familiar and reliable, were buried beneath deep drifts or glazed with ice that turned every step into a careful negotiation. Carts remained abandoned where they had become stuck, while sleds emerged as the preferred method of transport for those who dared venture out. The crisp scent of snow mingled with the earthy aroma of packed wood and horse tack, forming an atmosphere both invigorating and biting. Villagers adapted slowly, moving deliberately to protect both themselves and their animals. Horses and oxen pulling sleds were outfitted with additional blankets and harnesses checked for frost damage. Their breath curled in clouds visible against the gray-white landscape, each exhalation a soft rhythm punctuating the stillness. Loads of firewood, grain, and essential supplies were carefully balanced, distributed evenly to prevent tipping over icy terrain. Every movement slow and measured. Travel itself became a meditation in patience. Sleds creaked over uneven ice. Snow shifted unpredictably beneath runners, and each step for humans and animals alike required focused attention. Frostbitten hands adjusted reins, scraped ice from runners, or tested the stability of packed snow before advancing. The wind, gusting in sudden bursts, whispered across the frozen plains, reminding travelers that even familiar paths demanded respect and careful planning. Within villages, transportation influenced daily routines. Deliveries of food, mail, or messages moved at a languid pace, with neighbors coordinating schedules and assisting one another when paths became impassable. Children watched sleds from snow-covered windows, learning the rhythm of cautious movement, the patience required for safe travel, and the quiet cooperation that winter demanded. Every journey, no matter how small, became part of a slow, deliberate choreography, a soft, reassuring reminder that life continued despite frozen roads. Even moments of beauty punctuated the challenges. Icicles glittered along fence posts. Sunlight refracted across snow-covered fields, and the rhythmic crunch of sled runners or footsteps against packed snow created a gentle, hypnotic cadence. These subtle details, experienced alongside the necessity of careful movement, transformed each journey into a meditative, soothing passage through winter's embrace. In this frozen landscape, the frost reshaped how people, animals, and goods moved. Each cautious step, each balanced load, and each deliberate pause reinforced a rhythm of survival, patience, and resilience. Travel, once taken for granted, became a slow, mindful practice, a quiet dance of endurance against the relentless cold. The village markets had transformed under winter's weight. Open-air stalls, once bustling with activity and vibrant color, were now subdued, wrapped in cloths or straw to shield goods from snow and ice. Merchants moved deliberately, carefully adjusting wares, checking for frost damage, and arranging supplies to protect them from the creeping chill. The faint scent of wood smoke, mingled with dried herbs and preserved foods, created a warm, comforting aroma that softened the starkness of frozen streets. Villagers visiting the markets adapted with patience and care. Boots crunched softly against packed snow, mittens shielded frozen fingers, and breaths formed gentle clouds that mingled with the crisp winter air. Movement was slow, deliberate, ensuring that no one slipped or lost their footing. Even children followed carefully, observing the rhythm of cautious negotiation and learning the subtleties of winter adaptation. Goods were arranged thoughtfully with layered cloths and straw insulating vegetables, grains, and dried meats. Trades were made deliberately, each exchange accompanied by measured conversation, careful counting, and gentle gestures to protect fragile items. The frost slowed the usual hustle, replacing hurried barter with a calm, deliberate pace that allowed villagers to savor the small joys of shared interaction, even amidst hardship. Community gatherings, too, had adjusted to winter's embrace. Fires were set in central areas where villagers could convene safely, their warmth a gathering point for conversation, shared stories, and communal support. The hum of voices, soft and steady, carried over the frozen square, blending with the occasional laughter or the distant clatter of sleds delivering supplies. Even the cold, sharp wind seemed to soften near these pockets of warmth, as if respect for human connection tempered the frost's edge. The sensory details of these gatherings offered quiet comfort. Snow sparkled under the pale winter sun. Wooden stalls groaned gently beneath the weight of frost, and the smell of roasted chestnuts or preserved fruits lingered faintly in the air. Each careful interaction, each slow negotiation, reinforced a rhythm of community, patience, and endurance. A reminder that warmth could be found not only in fire, but also in connection and shared effort. Through deliberate care, thoughtful pacing, and gentle attention to both goods and people, markets and gatherings became sanctuaries of calm amid frozen streets. The frost reshaped commerce and social life, but it also revealed resilience, creativity, and the soothing rhythm of human adaptability. Even in the coldest days, villagers found warmth, both tangible and emotional, through measured interaction and mindful presence. Letters and messages had become treasures more than mere words. Snow and ice-covered roads, making the passage of mail slow, uncertain, and fraught with patience. Ink froze on parchment. Envelopes stiffened in the cold, and couriers wrapped letters carefully in cloth or straw to protect them from frostbite and moisture. The scent of damp paper mingled with the faint warmth of a nearby fire, creating a comforting, homely aroma amid the harsh, frozen landscape. Villagers waited with quiet anticipation. Letters that once traveled in days now took weeks, and each arrival was a gentle surprise. Children watched windows or listened for the faint creak of a sled approaching, while adults checked for parcels with careful hands, savoring the anticipation in soft, deliberate breaths. Even the smallest word from a distant friend, relative, or merchant carried profound reassurance. Each phrase, a small thread, connecting lives across the frozen expanse. Couriers and travelers moved slowly, deliberately, testing ice and snow, pausing to ensure animals were steady under heavy loads. Their voices were soft, communicating news, reminders, or instructions in measured tones. Every step, every careful adjustment of a saddle or bundle reinforced a rhythm of patient endurance. Frosty winds tried to erase tracks, but each deliberate action ensured that messages survived, reaching their destination intact and meaningful. Inside homes, reading and responding to letters became a gentle ritual. Hands warmed near the hearth held fragile pages. Ink was read slowly to absorb every word, and replies were written with measured attention. Children observed quietly, learning the value of patience, observation, and the quiet joy of connecting with someone far away. Even mundane updates became profound reminders of shared existence beyond the immediate frost. The frost shaped the landscape of communication with both challenge and beauty. Snow-muffled sound softened the edges of the day and created a quiet canvas for human connection to stand out. Each carefully protected letter, each deliberate step of a courier, each measured reading and reply formed part of a slow, comforting rhythm that linked hearts and homes across frozen distances. In this frozen stillness, patience and careful attention became as vital as warmth or sustenance. Messages traveled slowly, but their arrival carried quiet triumph, reassurance, and the gentle pulse of human connection, reinforcing the steady, meditative rhythm of life under the great frost. The long nights and frozen days had deepened the ville's sense of tradition and community. Winter celebrations and religious observances, once communal gatherings in bright halls or open courtyards, were now adapted to the hush and stillness of frost-bound villages. Candles glowed softly in windows, flickering in the sharp wind, and the smell of burning tallow mixed gently with the earthy scent of snow and smoke, creating an atmosphere of warmth and reverence. Families gathered in small, intimate spaces around hearths or inside simple chapels. Their voices softened to whispers. Hymns and prayers were sung slowly, deliberately, the sound carrying gently through frosted rooms and echoing. Journals captured daily observations and dreams, preserving continuity across days of frost and long nights. Each word written slowly, each careful line became a quiet affirmation that life endured, thoughts were valued, and human presence persisted amid the relentless grip of the great frost. Through letters, journals, and personal writing, villagers discovered a rhythm of reflection, patience, and quiet continuity. Even in the harshest of winters, the deliberate act of putting pen to paper created a gentle, sustaining heartbeat, a soft, meditative presence that connected minds, hearts, and days in the enduring silence of frost. Music had become a tender refuge from the biting cold. Instruments, carefully maintained despite the harsh environment, filled homes and small gathering spaces with gentle, soothing melodies. Wooden flutes, dulcimers, and lutes were cherished, their surfaces oiled and polished to prevent splitting in the icy air. Even small drums were treated with care, skins kept taut and warm to ensure a steady, soft beat. Villagers approached music slowly, deliberately, mindful of both the fragility of instruments and the meditative quality of sound. Fingers traced strings with gentle pressure, lips shaped to coax soft notes from flutes, and hands tapped lightly on drums to create rhythm without startling the quiet. The faint warm scent of polished wood mingled with fire smoke and the crisp air of frost-laden windows, grounding each note in both presence and place. Songs were often shared quietly by the hearth, voices low and soothing, blending seamlessly with the crackle of fire and the hush of snow outside. Children listened intently, learning melodies and harmonies in measured, calm rhythms. Lullabies, gentle refrains, and simple tunes created a serene backdrop for reflection, weaving connection and comfort across generations. Even improvised music followed the pace of the frost, deliberate, slow, and mindful. Each note a gentle echo against the still, frozen world. Outside, snow sparkled under moonlight, carrying faint echoes of song and instrument across the quiet village. The wind added subtle accompaniment, brushing against walls, chimneys, and trees, creating an ambient backdrop that intertwined with human melodies. These sounds, soft and deliberate, reinforced the rhythm of endurance, patience, and shared presence, turning music into both a practical solace and a quiet celebration of life. In this frost-bound world, every note played, every song sung, and every string plucked became a small act of meditation and connection. Music preserved calm, nurtured resilience, and offered warmth to both body and spirit. Even as the cold pressed in from outside, the deliberate practice of melody and rhythm provided a gentle heartbeat, a slow and soothing reminder that life, creativity, and comfort endured amid the great frost. A quiet rhythm of reflection had settled over the village. The relentless cold, the long nights, and the hushed, snow-laden days had shaped not only survival, but also a subtle sense of gratitude. Families gathered near hearths, hands warmed over fire, blankets drawn close, and hearts attuned to the small, deliberate comforts of life that persisted despite hardship. Villagers noticed and appreciated the smallest acts of care. A repaired coat protecting against frost, a shared loaf of bread, a carefully thawed pail of water, or a gentle touch to soothe chilled hands. Each observation became a meditative exercise in presence, a slow acknowledgement of resilience, patience, and community. The faint scent of smoke mingled with the crisp aroma of snow pressed against windows created a calming atmosphere that encouraged reflection and gentle contemplation. Children were taught to recognize the value in each day. Even under frost's dominion, simple lessons, watching animals, tending fires, or observing snow-laden fields, became quiet reminders of endurance, connection, and the beauty of care. Laughter, though softer than in warmer months, punctuated quiet moments like delicate sparkles, reminding everyone that life continued quietly, patiently, and meaningfully. Evenings were filled with gentle reflection. Elders shared stories of past winters, emphasizing patience and gratitude, while adults quietly considered what had been preserved, what had been achieved, and the acts of kindness that had made survival possible. Outside, the wind murmured against rooftops. The snow glistened under moonlight, and the village lay still in a serene tableau. These moments of calm allowed thoughts to settle, worries to soften, and hearts to appreciate continuity and endurance. The frost, though harsh, had cultivated mindfulness, patience, and subtle joy. Every repaired garment, every careful meal, every shared story became a quiet meditation on life's value. In this way, reflection and gratitude formed a slow, sustaining rhythm, a heartbeat of reassurance, presence, and hope. Villagers learned to find warmth not only in fire, but in mindful acknowledgement of small victories, gentle care, and the enduring pulse of life around them. The village had settled into a quiet, reflective rhythm, a delicate balance between endurance and calm. The relentless cold had shaped every aspect of life: hearths, garments, water, animals, roads, and even human hearts. Yet through careful attention, patience, and gentle presence, families had discovered a slow, sustaining cadence that brought warmth, safety, and reassurance. Despite the frozen world beyond their doors, the early evening cast long, pale shadows across snow-draped rooftops. Smoke rose in slender trails from chimneys, curling gently into the crisp, still air. Inside, soft firelight flickered across wooden beams, quilts, and faces. Children leaned close to parents or elders, listening to low conversations, the faint laughter of small victories, and the quiet, comforting sounds of a home carefully maintained. The air carried the mingling scent of warm bread, melted tallow, and wool, a sensory cocoon of familiarity and comfort. Families moved deliberately, each task infused with mindfulness. Folding blankets, tending embers, checking water, adjusting animal bedding, or preparing modest evening meals. Even minor gestures, stroking a child's hair, dabbing a chilled hand, smoothing a patch of wool, became tender acts of care, reinforcing the slow, soothing rhythm of survival. Every measured movement, every small attention was a heartbeat of reassurance against the endless frost. Outside, the wind softened as night deepened, snow settling quietly over frozen fields and forests. The world beyond the village seemed hushed, suspended in silver light and gentle stillness. Inside, the gentle rhythms of human life, the crackle of fire, whispered conversation, the soft shuffle of feet, became a quiet counterpoint, a steadying presence in a world paused by ice and cold. In this serene, frost-bound tableau, villagers reflected on endurance, patience, and subtle joy. They recognized the value of connection, community, and mindful care. Even in the harshest winter, life persisted in gentle patterns, deliberate, comforting, and meditative. And as the village drifted toward evening rest, every heartbeat, every breath, and every flickering candle contributed to a final harmonious cadence, a slow, soothing pulse that carried the world from hardship toward calm, safety, and gentle hope.